Hello, everyone. My name is Emmanuel. I am making this video to respond to an interview that went on between Jordan Peterson and Mrs. Magath a few months ago. I watched it on YouTube. It was titled, "Africa is not poor because of colonization." At the time, I wanted to respond to the interview, but for some reasons I didn't. But events in Africa now gives a perfect opportunity to respond to that interview. What is happening now is exactly the kind of stuff that I wanted to portray to Ms. Magath, or to explain how I couldn't understand how she thinks that you can carry out a social activity like the one she's doing, entrepreneurship startups, which is a very good project, which I commend her for it. But I couldn't understand how you could carry out something like that without considering the other social factors that are, influencing what you're trying to do. And that's why I thought she made that statement. I thought it was actually a statement out of frustration rather than a statement that has been analyzed. And I think Jordan Peterson is smart enough to understand that there's a lot more to what is going on in Africa than, just throwing out a statement like Africa is not poor because of colonization. To refresh your minds, let's watch the video first, and then I'll go back to what points I wanted to make in relation to the statement.
Well, you list here in one of your articles where you make reference to these rating systems, the bottom 10 countries for doing business in the world: Chad, Haiti, Central African Republic, Congo Democratic Republic, South Sudan, Libya, Yemen, Venezuela, there's a lovely example, Eritrea and Somalia. And so there are three exceptions in the African ecosystem: Mauritius, Rwanda, Kenya, South Africa, Botswana, and Zambia. You pointed out in your prospectus, is it prospectus article?
Yeah, prospectus article of Artbridge Institute.
Right, that Mauritius is a rising star. And Rwanda is in some ways comparable to Georgia. So some of these countries have started to get this right.
Yes.
And so what's the consequence of that? And what does right mean?
What they have understood, what these countries have understood, is that economic freedom is at the center for prosperity building. Rwanda, for example, Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, is explicit about it. He said he wants to be the Lee Kuan Yew he wants to be the Singapore of Africa, and Lee Kuan Yew is his model. Now, the dirty mouths are gonna start shouting, "Oh yeah, see, authoritarian, blah, blah, blah." Whatever. Me, I wanna talk only about the on the economic side. If you take Lee Kuan Yew and Singapore as your example, then it means that, like him, you're gonna have to be serious about economic freedom. And that's exactly what he did. That's what Singapore did. When Singapore figured that out, they went on to put in the right reforms to make their environment some of the most business-friendly environments in the world, one of the most free markets environment in the world, and you saw the magic of Singapore. Today, Singapore is richer than its ex-colonizer, Great Britain. So when I hear people telling me today, "Oh, Africa is poor because of colonization," I'm like, please, let's move on from that. Does it have maybe a tiny percentage in where we are today? Maybe, and I don't know. But I know it's not the cause, because if it were, many countless countries have been colonized before. And by the way, colonizing one another is humanity's history. It just happened that maybe Africa has been one of the last, colonized region in the world. So in our psyche, it is there, and it acts like nothing happened before to others. But flash news, it's the history of the world. We've been capturing each other back and forth, all of that. So anyway, but the truth is, Singapore, richer than Great Britain today. And then Hong Kong happened. And then because Hong Kong happened, China even today happened. Because China's like, wait a minute, what went on over there? And then China went on to do the exact same thing with its SEZs, the special economic zones, some of the most free market zones in the world. And then look at it happen in communist China, who, when it comes to economics, decided that we're going to do the free market, we're going to be capitalist, because that's the only way. We tried everything else. We killed hundreds of millions of people, and we have nothing to show for it. But now that we're tired of being disrespected members of society, because guess what? That's the other thing too. You want to be respected in this world? You're going to have to be among the prosperous ones.
Yes, as you must have heard, she's making some very good points there, which again, I don't fault her for all these very positive points and, you know, projects and ideas. There's one thing that I wanted to mention first before we delve into the argument was, is I find it difficult sometimes to hear Europeans and other people treating Africa like a country. Africa is a continent. So, and it gets even worse when it's an African referring to Africa like a country. Because she's talking about Africa and is comparing it to Singapore, to Hong Kong, to China. These are countries. Africa is a continent with 54 countries. So there are countries in Africa who are doing great, who are progressive and practicing progressive economy and have a very high rate of economic development. And there are countries that are struggling. So if we are talking about Africa, I think it's important to make this difference and to cite individual countries. Of course, in the beginning, she spoke about Paul Kagame in Rwanda. So, which leads me to what to the response I wanted to give to this video. Now, for anyone who thinks Africa is not poor because of colonization, there are two things in this statement. First of all, Africa is not poor. Some Africans are poor, but Africa as a continent is not poor. Africa has one of the richest areas and one of the richest countries in the world. So Africa is mismanaged and not poor. Now, you ask, why is Africa not managed then? And that's where the effect and the remnants of colonization comes in my opinion. Now, there are three things I want to explain here. Let's start by trade, for example, because she was talking about free trade and all that. Africa has always practiced free trade. In fact, it's the destruction of free trade by colonization that is one of the main things, in my opinion, that is affecting Africa till today. And that's why I said I find it difficult for anyone practicing a social experiment or social activity like what she's doing, trying to improve entrepreneurship and all that. I find it difficult for her to isolate that, what she's trying to do, to other social factors that are impacting what she's trying to do. Look at Britain today. Look at Europe today. Most of the railroads we see in Europe today and in Britain, most of the roads connecting the north and the south, Newcastle to down London, are roads that were started during the days of coal trade, where coal merchants used to get coal from Newcastle, bring it down to the south to sell. These roads were started in like tracks, canals, trucks with carriages being pulled by horses. And during Industrial Revolution, as the Industrial Revolution progressed, these roads became railways and have entrenched into the English trade system. What did colonization do in Africa? The first thing colonization did in Africa is destroyed all the old existing trade routes. Most of the countries were severed from each other. Communities that used to be single communities were split into two, one taken by another colonial power, part of the same community goes to another colonial power. The result is all this intertrade that was happening in Africa, Central Africa buying from the old kingdom of Ghana, buying metal, brass, and all that. All this intertrade was severed, and new trade links were created for raw materials to be brought down to the coast and exported to Europe. So hence, today, most of the new countries, because most African countries are only young. Most of them are only about 60, 70 years old. So they are still trying to rebuild these roots. That's why you see, even till present, intra-African trade is still very low. Communities that used to trade with each other, regardless of the rest of the world, because Africa used to trade with itself to supply its good and grew for centuries like that. But now, our trade is more vibrant with the outside world than intra-African trade. So that is the relics of colonization. And that's something, I'm not saying that it's something that cannot be fixed, but life cycles of countries are long. So it will be fixed with time, but that, as one of the cause of Africa's poverty, is a relic from colonization. So I firmly put the blame of some African countries' poverty today on the doors of colonization. Now, the second part I wanted to talk about today is the political architecture in Africa. Back in the colonial days, most of the political representatives in Africa were there to serve their colonial gangsters, or the colonial masters, as you want to call it. So they were there to represent the colonial gangsters, site, arrange and organize the transportation of raw materials and minerals down to the port, and then it's transported to Europe. They were not there to represent the interests of the local people. The local people were not part of the organization of administration, either direct rule or by indirect rule, as France and Britain practiced in Africa. None of them had any regards to the local people. The political, the administrative elite in Africa at the time was there to serve the colonial gangsters. Fast forward 60 years after the so-called independence, this political architecture has stayed. In Africa, most of the elites, once they are elected, most of the political elites, I call them political mercenaries, once they are elected, what they do is turn their back to the local population and to the population that elected them and start serving a European interest. That's exactly what is happening now with the ECOWAS and Niger. You see, Niger is part of the 14 colonies that France has in Africa in modern days. And Niger is trying to remove France's, they're trying to shake free the chains of colonization by France. But what is the rest of the ECOWAS West African states doing? They are planning to invade Niger to prevent her from breaking free, from removing France's foot on her neck. So if you talk about colonization as if it's something that is that came and went, the colonization of Africa is still there. France still has 14 to 15 colonies in the 21st century. So colonization is not over. So if you are trying to if you are trying to practice entrepreneurship, and these are all microeconomic activities, and these activities cannot operate where the macroeconomic is not sorted. This system of winding bureaucracy or frustrating bureaucracy that she's talking about is inherited from France. It's a civil law system, as she says, and France is keen for this system to stay in Africa, and they will do everything for systems like this to stay. And you would ask why Africa is not fighting to liberate itself, and that's exactly what is happening now with Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Niger. Because, believe you me, France is not willing to live in peace. If we don't fight, France is not going to leave. And if you think that a country like Niger that exports 30% of the world's uranium is a poor country, then you're getting it all wrong. So that's why I say Africa is not poor. Africans are poor because of the mismanagement of Africa, both by predatory elites put in place by European powers and by European powers themselves and by the World Bank. It's deliberate for Africa to stay where it is. You can't compare these countries with Singapore, Hong Kong, and China, Dubai. These are fully independent countries. The 15 countries we're talking about in Africa do not have their own currency. You know, their currency is still manufactured in France and sent to them with strict orders to be pegged to European EU currency. So now, what sort of economy can flourish without the government being able to manipulate the currency and adjust interest rates to suit local production and local consumption and local demand and supply? That's why these colonial powers still have control over Africa, and Africa would not move forward if we don't become fully independent. So we can talk about microeconomics and whatever thing we're trying to organize there, but nothing is going to progress if these countries are not sovereign. In fact, I think if I understand well, the video is about promoting capitalism in Africa, free markets in Africa. And her point is towards the organizers of Black Lives Matter, who are anti-capitalist. So she's trying to say that without capitalism, poverty cannot be resolved in Africa. Well, before I get into that, I want to mention one thing, very important. Colonialism is the brainchild of capitalism. Is capitalism executed in its most savage form? Slavery, colonization are all brainchildren of capitalism. Capitalism, in that sense, is about getting the most you can get from anybody, regardless of how you get it. Get rich by any means. It's not only about free markets. Free markets have been practiced in Africa for centuries. I'll repeat that again. But let's watch the video and let's see what she's saying there, and I'll come back to what I'm trying to say.
What would you recommend concretely to countries like Senegal to get the hell out of the way, let's say, of the people who would, like you, would do everything they could to try to make it better? I mean, one of the things that happened with India is India established the Indian Institute of Technology, which is a deadly engineering school, and a huge number of its graduates went to Silicon Valley, as you well know. And many of the successful Indian graduates of IIT started to dump money back into India and build a capitalist infrastructure there, or help build a capitalist infrastructure there. So this sort of thing can really take hold. If you were making recommendations to governments who wanted to get on board and stop being like Chad, Haiti, Central African Republic, Congo, South Sudan, Libya, Yemen, and Venezuela, etc., what concrete steps should they take from the bottom up to get the hell out of the way?
Exactly. So two things we've been doing, because I'm a practitioner, that's my entrepreneurial journey. I'm an entrepreneur, so I practice what I preach. But I also preach. I preach for free markets. And so when it comes to that, one of the hats that I wear is as the director for the African Center for Prosperity of the Atlas Network, the largest organization in the world of free market think tanks around the world. And so what we do there is we work on reforms around the world to take down barriers of entry for local entrepreneurs. So that's one thing. But as we all know, that's a great initiative to take, and we've been making some really good advances in many countries, especially in Ghana. We've been making a lot of progress with our partners there, Imani. But that is piecemeal legislation. It takes forever. It is hard as heck, and by the time you made a gain here, you made 20 losses over there, and it's a continuous problem. But
so you see, like she just said, what she's doing is making progress, and especially in what country? In Ghana. Now, Jordan Peterson spoke about Indians who got out of India in the Silicon Valley and sent back money to India. Now, let me tell you, if you are part of the 15 colonies, if you are part of the 15 French colonies in Africa today, wherever you are in the world, when you send money to your country, Central Africa, Chad, Cameroon, when you send money to your country, the money doesn't go to your country. The money goes to France first. France converts the money into CFA. And then they take whatever percentage they take, sometimes almost 30 to 40% of the money you send, they take it there for the rate of conversion. And then they send the money to Cameroon, and then they charge for being the country that is actually keeping the reserve of that money that they've converted and sent to Cameroon. I don't know if you understand the complexity of that. Just to tell you that most of these countries could not operate like India, even if they want to. Just to say that most of these countries could not operate like India, even if they wanted to. A lot of us do send money back home. But if you send money back home, only about 50% of the money gets to Cameroon or to your whatever country you send, if it's part of the French colonies. Secondly, I wanted to talk about free trade, because she talks a lot about free trade here. At micro level, African countries practice free trade. At macro level, they don't practice free trade, because at macro level, African free trade is not governed by demand and supply. At macro level, African free trade is governed by the price that is determined by Western countries, by the buyers. No French colony can sell any raw material or mineral at market price. They sell it at the price France wants them to sell it for. So how can you run a country where the most importance, where you don't determine the price of the most importance of your products? So colonialism is at the heart of Africa's poverty. And if it's not dealt with, Africa is going to continue to be poor. The reason why I chose to respond to this video now is because 4 West African countries so far are trying to break free from these colonial chains. And I'm calling at people like Jordan Peterson to talk about this. Because if colonialism is not stopped, we're going to continue in circles. Mrs. Magat talks of Ghana. The reason why she's finding success in Ghana is because Ghana uses common law. Ghana practices common law. Most English-speaking countries practice common law. So it's working in some of these countries, even though the bureaucracy is still much, but it's possible to make progress in this country with the microeconomy, because the macroeconomy is somehow sorted. Although I greatly hold Ghana responsible as part of ECOWAS for trying to continue or to turn a blind eye to what France is doing to its neighboring countries, and even trying to help France's bid to invade Niger. However, they are moving faster than the French colonies, which is a good thing for Ghanaians and for Africa. But I hope that they can understand that these other 15 colonies are poor because of colonization, and most other African countries, Zimbabwe, that's still suffering United States sanction for the past 23 years for trying to reclaim its land that was seized and stolen by white imperialist, invaders and supremacists in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is suffering United States sanctions for the past 23 years for trying to get its land back. So you say Africa is not poor because of colonization? I think you got it all wrong. Does it mean that we can't progress? We can progress. Of course, we can move forward. We can become great. But we can't become great during colonization. We need to stop. We need to get rid of France and the other powers in Africa. And then we can have free economic zones as much as we want. We can deal in our own currency. We can improve intra-African trade. And African poverty would become a thing of the past. Thanks for watching. And I'm going to continue making videos like this. And I hope you find it interesting to listen. See you soon.